Yeah.
So once we have mechanism of action down, we can talk about a few key stuff about these drugs. So we can start with cyclophosphamide. Again, they like to ask about this drug. Um, and for starters, not so high yield, but I'll mention it. Cyclophosphamide, it's activated by cytochrome P450, right? Cytochrome P450, it's an enzyme found within the liver. When I say it's activated, essentially, if you have no cytochrome P450, then cyclophosphamide will not work. For cyclophosphamide to work, cytochrome P450 has to activate it, right, guys? Also, what that means is if cytochrome P450 is found in the liver, if a patient has any liver pathology, like liver cirrhosis, or they have fat deposition in the liver, or any one of those issues, or if they have some form of hepatocellular cancer, what can happen is cytochrome P450 can either be deficient in those patients or it can be upregulated. Therefore, we have to be mindful of this. Meaning, if a patient has a liver pathology, cyclophosphamide might not be able to work simply because the liver does not have cytochrome P450 within it, right? So those are just some things to bear in mind. Now, when you ingest cyclophosphamide, as with majority of drugs that you have, they will be broken down into some form of waste product, right? Or some form of metabolite, as they'll say clinically. Cyclophosphamide is broken down into two things. It can either be broken down into phosphoramide mustard or acrolein, right? Typically, the cyclophosphamide is broken down into acrolein, right? And you have a bunch of problems with acrolein. So for one, acrolein actually it stays in the bladder for a while. Because remember, all drugs they get either urinated or defecated out. Now, the kidney, as it filters out these waste products and it passes through the ureter and it gets to the bladder, right? Acrolein will stay in the bladder for a while because remember, for example, if you want to pee now or later, sometimes they hold it in, right? So like a lot of times these waste products they get stored in the bladder, right? So acrolein is in the bladder. And as acrolein is in the bladder and you have urine and whatnot, the acrolein interacts with the epithelium within the bladder. And it interacts in such a way that it actually wears away the epithelium. And you get something called hemorrhagic cystitis. So wherever you see cystitis, cystitis just means inflammation of the bladder. So if you see cystitis, it means inflammation of bladder, right? And if you say hemorrhagic, because I know you guys know what hemorrhagic is, but hey, I'm assuming we don't know. Hemorrhagic just means bleeding, essentially, right? So acrolein, when it's deposited in the bladder, interacts with the epithelium within the bladder, is going to actually damage the bladder to cause inflammation, because wherever you have damage, you have inflammation. And this inflammation is so bad and the damage is so bad that it causes bleeding. So patients with that ingest cyclophosphamide, they can experience this as a side effect, right? They can have bleeding within the bladder and the bladder is inflamed, right? Therefore, patients might complain of urinating blood because remember, if you have bleeding in the bladder, naturally you're going to pee blood. The act of peeing blood is called hematuria, right? Hematuria. Hem means blood. So that's why we see hemorrhagic, it means blood. There's some form of bleeding. So if I were to show you guys a picture of that, we can look over here, right? This is a diagram of the bladder. If you look, it looks okay. Maybe you guys can't appreciate inflammation that well, but it's very inflamed. You can see a lot of blood vessels here. It looks really red. You see blood here. That's the hemorrhagic aspect of it, right? The bleeding. And it looks kind of swollen. I mean, I know you guys won't appreciate some of these things, but you guys can at least appreciate the bleeding, right? And just take my word for it. This is a bladder, right? So yeah, so this is hemorrhagic cystitis. It's a complication of taking cyclophosphamide, right? The other metabolite, phosphoramide mustard, it doesn't cause hemorrhagic cystitis per se, but it can be toxic to cells. So it can be toxic to the cells of the kidney, can be toxic to just any cell really. And of course, that causes problems as well. All right. Lastly, cyclophosphamide can also cause bone marrow suppression. So cyclophosphamide, again, so let me see if I can not spoon feed this to you guys. But okay, when you take cyclophosphamide, it's a drug, right? It's going to be distributed via, you're going to ingest it, or it can be given IV or whatever the case is. When the patient gets it, naturally it will eventually get to the bloodstream. And of course, remember you have blood vessels within the bone as well. And do you guys know what cells are produced in the bone? I am probably assuming too much, maybe not. Does anyone have any idea what important cell is produced in the bone? Any ideas? Starts with R, has a red appearance. All right, good. Red blood cells. So red blood cells are made in the bone. White blood cells are also made in the bone. Does anybody remember, you know, the duration of how long a red blood cell can live? Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. It's in the hundreds. Any ideas? 120 days. Or, yeah, so 120 days. So that's great. So that's correct, Miguel. And red blood cells live for 120 days. So right off the bat, guess what? Cyclophosphamide is an alkylating agent. Alkylating agents, they are a class of antineoplastic drugs, right? Okay, great. Remember, antineoplastic drugs target cells that are rapidly dividing. In the body, red blood cells and white blood cells, those are cells that the body continuously produces on a daily basis. So right off the bat, you can imagine if a patient is taking cyclophosphamide or any alkylating agent really, it can suppress the bone marrow. It can prevent those red blood cells, those white blood cells from being produced, simply because naturally those cells are rapidly dividing cells. They're in high demand, right? Because they die quickly, so the body makes them quickly, right? So that's why cyclophosphamide can suppress the bone marrow, prevent the bone marrow from making red blood cells, white blood cells, right? Because again, these drugs target rapidly dividing cells, right? Hopefully everybody understands that. Does everybody understand that? Yes? No? Maybe? Probably? All right, great. Good. I'm sorry if I'm going fast, guys, but yeah. Okay, so this hemorrhagic cystitis that, you know, naturally is a problem within the bladder. So patients that take cyclophosphamide, they can definitely get the hemorrhagic cystitis that you see to the right. So to treat it, you know, they came up with two drugs that you can use. You can use Mesna or you can use N-acetylcysteine. You don't need to know what Mesna means, but you know, for those of you that are curious, it's mercaptoethene sulfonate sodium, right? And that's Mesna, but again, examine like a month. Don't bother swat what that means. Like by all means, just remember Mesna. Trust me. So Mesna, it's first line, and what Mesna does is it will filter itself through the kidneys, into the urethra, into the bladder. Mesna has a high affinity, meaning it loves acrolein. It will bind to acrolein rapidly and strong, right? Mesna will essentially pick up all the acrolein, right? And when it picks it up, it neutralizes it. So the acrolein is no longer toxic to the bladder. So a lot of times when they give patients cyclophosphamide to treat some form of cancer, they can also administer Mesna to prevent this hemorrhagic cystitis, right? To allow the acrolein to essentially be neutralized. Of course, if you don't have Mesna available at the hospital, you can also use another drug called N-acetylcysteine. It works similar to Mesna. It will bind to the acrolein, mop it up in the bladder, neutralize it, and the patient just pees out that new composition of acrolein bonded to Mesna or N-acetylcysteine, right? And yeah, so you guys need to be familiar with that. So the question is, why does acrolein stay in the bladder? So the thing about acrolein is, and I mean, you guys really don't need to know, but just for your curiosity, acrolein, it's, all right, so the structure of it, it's kind of slightly spiky, right? So what it will do, and it's really small. So as it's filtered through the kidneys, and naturally, because the bladder is this storage area for urine, so the urine is basically static in the bladder once it gets there. The acrolein can basically just settle on the bladder, and it starts to interact with the epithelium within the bladder. Because again, the structure is it's slightly spiky, so it kind of hooks on to the epithelium, and you have some form of chemical reaction happening afterwards, and it starts to degrade the epithelium of the bladder, right? So essentially, that's what happens with acrolein. And yeah, now great. Now cyclophosphamide, right? It has a very important clinical use. So let me cross this off. So I have half-life 6 to 12 hours. I think we know what half-life means, but it's basically the length of time required for a drug to be depleted by half its original concentration. Again, though, when you study drugs, you don't necessarily need to swat the half-life. I know it's on the drug list, but gosh, they don't expect you to know these half-lives like that. So don't worry about it. Not sure why I put it there, but yeah, don't worry about that. Anywho, if you give cyclophosphamide at a low dosage, it can suppress T cells, right? T cells are a form of white blood cells, right? Remember, you have B cells and you have T cells. So low dose cyclophosphamide can actually suppress T cells. This is of clinical importance. Reason being, you guys know you have autoimmune diseases like SLE, systemic lupus erythematosus, right? Or just lupus for short. And you also have something called Wegener's granulomatosis. Both of these things are autoimmune conditions that can be treated with cyclophosphamide.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.